They rolled the bulldozers in before sunrise, before Caleb Rourke could even pull the faded sign off his father's garage. Evelyn Hawthorne stood behind the security fence, her heels untouched by the dust, calling the place a rusted eyesore standing in the way of an empire. Caleb didn't shout. He simply picked a broken key off the cracked concrete and asked whether anyone had checked the old land survey from 1949. Evelyn laughed. 2 weeks later, that single question would cost her company millions of dollars in a courtroom and force an empire built on borrowed confidence to kneel before a mechanic in oil-stained coveralls. If you love watching arrogant power finally kneel to quiet justice, hit subscribe and stay with this channel for more stories exactly like this one. The garage sat at the edge of Dallas like a forgotten tooth in a mouth full of glass and steel, surrounded by cranes, billboards, and a scale model of something called the Hawthorne Dominion Campus, a sprawling complex of office towers, a data center, an electric vehicle showroom, and luxury residences that together carried a price tag north of $1 billion. Every other lot for half a mile in any direction had already been swallowed by the project. Fences erected, foundations poured, glass panels stacked and waiting to be lifted into place by machines taller than the old buildings they replaced. Rourke & Son Auto Garage remained the single stubborn exception. A low structure with a tin roof gone the color of rust, steel door that had been painted and repainted so many times nobody could remember its original color. Inside sat a handful of vintage cars in various states of repair. A workbench inherited from a man who had died with grease permanently worked into the lines of his palms, and a cramped office stacked with folders that looked, to anyone glancing in from outside, like nothing more than clutter destined for a dumpster. To Evelyn Hawthorne it looked exactly like that, an inconvenience, a splinter lodged in the otherwise smooth completion of her signature project, and she had already decided, long before she ever spoke to the man who owned it, that the splinter would be removed one way or another. She sent an offer through an intermediary first, a number so far below market value that her own acquisitions team had joked about it over lunch, and when Caleb declined without so much as a counteroffer, she took it as confirmation of something she already believed about people like him. Conrad Kingswell, chairman of the Hawthorne Dominion Board, put it more bluntly during a phone call that Evelyn later recounted with a thin smile, saying that a struggling mechanic clinging to a dying trade had no business slowing down the future of an entire skyline. Neither of them had bothered to send anyone to actually walk the boundary lines of the parcel, to pull the deed history further back than the last sale, or to ask why the surveyor's report kept referencing a narrow strip of land nobody in the modern filings seemed to fully account for. They had the money, the architects, the lawyers, and the headlines already written in their minds, and none of it required, in their view, actually understanding what sat beneath the ground they intended to pave. The first time Evelyn came to the garage in person, she wore heels that never touched a puddle and a coat that cost more than Caleb's truck, and she stood just inside the open bay door long enough to wrinkle her nose at the smell of motor oil before informing him that he should feel grateful anyone was still willing to pay for what she called a pile of scrap metal masquerading as a business. Conrad stood a step behind her, arms folded, offering the kind of thin, indulgent smile men like him reserved for people they had already stopped considering equals, and he added that a man in Caleb's position clinging to nostalgia over opportunity was, in his words, almost admirable in its stupidity. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, looked at both of them for a long moment, and said only that they were building an empire on top of something they had never actually owned. Evelyn laughed at that, a short, dismissive sound, certain the man in front of her was bluffing with nothing more than wounded pride and a stubborn attachment to a building not worth the land it occupied. She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, already composing in her head the next steps to clear the obstacle, never once imagining that the folder in Caleb's cramped little office held a document that could unravel the very ground beneath her billion-dollar campus. Evelyn had built her reputation on speed, on the ability to close deals and clear sites faster than any of her competitors, and that reputation had made her one of the youngest chief executives ever to run a company the size of Hawthorne Dominion. She had learned early in her career that hesitation cost money, that every week spent double-checking paperwork was a week competitors could use to steal a contract or a headline, and she had built an entire executive team around people who shared that same instinct for speed over caution. Conrad had recruited her personally years earlier, precisely because she moved that way, and the two of them had developed an unspoken understanding that obstacles, whether zoning boards, environmental reviews, or reluctant landowners, existed primarily to be managed rather than genuinely considered. That philosophy had served the company well through a string of earlier projects, each one completed ahead of schedule and under budget, and neither Evelyn nor Conrad saw any reason a modest garage on the edge of their newest campus should be treated any differently than the dozen smaller obstacles they had cleared before it. What neither of them accounted for was the difference between a landowner willing to be bought and a family that had spent 3 generations treating a piece of paper the same way other families treated an heirloom, something to be protected rather than liquidated at the first attractive offer. To understand why Caleb refused every offer, it helps to understand what the garage actually was to him, because it had never simply been a place where engines got fixed and bills got paid. His father, Walter Rourke, had built the business from nothing decades earlier, working on delivery trucks, ambulances, and the pickups belonging to laborers and tradesmen who kept the rest of the city running without ever appearing in anyone's glossy brochure. Caleb had grown up beneath that same tin roof, learning to diagnose a failing engine by sound alone before he learned to drive, and after his wife passed away he raised his daughter, Lena, largely inside those same 4 walls, teaching her how to hand him a wrench before she could tie her own shoes. He was not a wealthy man by any definition the city recognized, had no lawyers on retainer, and no seat on any board, and his days were built around the same unglamorous rhythm of fixing cars, paying invoices, and keeping a roof over his daughter's head. People who meant well had told him for years that he should simply sell, take whatever money the growing city offered, and start over somewhere quieter, and he had turned every one of those suggestions aside without much explanation, because the garage held more than tools and old cars. It held every map, every contract, and every scrap of paperwork his grandfather had carefully preserved from a time when the land around the garage had been part of a working industrial corridor rather than a monument to somebody else's ambition. His grandfather had once managed the service routes running through that corridor, and in 1949 the Rourke family had purchased not only the small parcel that eventually became the garage, but also a narrow strip of adjoining land running beneath what later became a service road, a drainage system, and a utility corridor connecting out to the main thoroughfare. Over decades of resales and rezoning, as larger companies bought and sold the surrounding parcels, that narrow strip had simply been overlooked, buried inside outdated filings that nobody with any real power had ever bothered to double-check. Caleb knew the history, but had never used it for leverage, content simply to keep his garage running and his daughter fed until bulldozers arrived on land his family still legally controlled. One evening, not long before everything came apart, Lena asked her father why he wouldn't just sell and make life easier for both of them, and he told her that there were things a person could sell that would stop making them poor and simultaneously stop making them who they were. He kept his father's old ledgers in a fireproof cabinet beside the workbench, pages filled with handwriting that grew shakier toward the final years, recording every repair, every invoice, and every small kindness Walter had extended to customers who couldn't pay in full that month. Caleb had inherited more than tools from that cabinet. He had inherited a particular understanding that a business built on trust outlived any business built on speed. And that understanding made him immune to the kind of urgency Hawthorne Dominion tried to manufacture around him. He remembered his grandfather only in fragments, a tall, quiet man who smelled of diesel and peppermint. But the stories Walter told painted a picture of someone who had walked that same industrial corridor every morning for 3 decades, checking drainage grates and service lines as though the whole neighborhood belonged to him in some way beyond simple ownership. It was that same grandfather who had insisted on purchasing the narrow utility strip alongside the garage parcel, telling anyone who asked that a man should own the ground beneath his own feet completely, right down to the pipes and wires nobody else bothered to think about. Caleb had grown up believing that story was mostly sentiment, a family myth about foresight passed down the way other families passed down recipes or songs, until the day machinery began driving support pilings directly through the middle of a corridor his family had quietly paid taxes on for decades. He did not immediately understand the scale of what his grandfather had actually secured, only that something did not add up between the surveyor stakes appearing along the edge of his lot and the boundary lines drawn on the fading blueprint tucked inside his father's old filing cabinet. That quiet unease became the seed of everything that followed, long before any lawyer, any judge, or any bulldozer entered the story at all. The pressure on Evelyn to move faster came from every direction inside Hawthorne Dominion because the campus had already been marketed publicly as the defining symbol of a new Dallas skyline, and any delay threatened office leases, data center contracts, and the confidence of investors who had poured enormous sums into a timeline that left no room for a stubborn mechanic. Conrad pushed her relentlessly, insisting that a single outdated garage could not be allowed to stall an empire. And Blaze Whitford, the company's lead attorney, proposed a faster route that skipped negotiation almost entirely. His plan involved filing a rapid succession of code violation notices, framing the garage as an environmental hazard unfit for continued operation, and using those notices to request an emergency demolition order from the city before Caleb could organize any real defense. Nobody on the legal team bothered to verify the underlying property records with any real scrutiny, because their attention was fixed entirely on whether Caleb had the financial resources to fight back in court, and they assumed, correctly for a while, that he did not. Meanwhile, Maris Bellamy, the company's communications director, built a public narrative around the dispute, feeding local outlets a story about one selfish holdout threatening thousands of promised jobs, and headlines soon appeared framing Caleb as an obstacle to the city's progress rather than a man defending his family's land. Caleb sent a formal letter warning that Hawthorne Dominion's construction encroached on land his family still held valid claim to, and Blaze mocked the letter openly in a meeting, telling a junior associate that the mechanic could bring his little deed to court if he could even find one that still functioned. Late one night, before Caleb had any chance to secure a restraining order, Evelyn approved the emergency demolition, calculating that a garage already reduced to rubble would leave him too demoralized and too broke to keep fighting, and that the project could simply move forward on the strength of an irreversible fact on the ground. When the machines arrived just before dawn, Caleb ran to the fence in time to watch the sign bearing his father's name torn from its post, and he stood there in silence. No shouting, no violence, only the particular kind of helplessness that comes from watching money and power dismantle something a family had spent 3 generations protecting. Evelyn believed, standing there in her spotless heels, that breaking the garage meant breaking the man, without understanding that she had just destroyed the one thing that might have kept him willing to negotiate quietly at all. Days later, under the supervision of a bored security guard who assumed he was there only for sentimental salvage, Caleb returned to what remained of the garage, not to gather tools but to dig through the cracked concrete of the old office floor for a steel box his father had buried there years earlier. Walter had told him once, in the plain and unhurried way he explained most things, that if anyone ever claimed the land no longer belonged to the Rourke family, Caleb should open that box and let the paperwork speak for itself. Inside he found the original 1949 survey map, the founding transfer agreement, a notarized certificate establishing permanent ownership of what the documents called the Rourke Utility Corridor, and a stack of tax receipts stretching back decades, each one proof that the family had continued paying taxes on that narrow strip of land long after everyone else had apparently forgotten it existed. The corridor ran beneath the service road, the electrical lines, and the primary access route into the entire industrial zone, meaning that while it looked insignificant on any modern map, it sat directly beneath the most structurally important point of the entire Hawthorne Dominion campus. Caleb carried the documents to Nora Tilling, a sharp local attorney more accustomed to being underestimated by big firms than to being taken seriously by them, and she read through the paperwork in near total silence before finally looking up and telling him that Hawthorne Dominion had not simply destroyed his garage, they had built an empire directly on top of land he still legally owned. If the documents held up, the consequences would extend far beyond compensation for a demolished building, potentially forcing a halt to construction, triggering damages for trespassing on protected land, and requiring the company to renegotiate terms for using the corridor at all. Caleb did not celebrate any of it. He simply looked at the old map spread across Nora's desk and said quietly that he had warned them. When Nora filed an emergency motion demanding a construction freeze and a full investigation into the disputed land, the papers landed on Blaze Whitford's desk, and he laughed out loud in front of two colleagues, certain that decades-old paperwork stood no chance against a legal team with unlimited resources. Evelyn shared his confidence, assuming Caleb was simply angling for a larger settlement after losing his garage, and Conrad advised her firmly against showing any flexibility, warning that if a single mechanic managed to extract concessions, every other small landowner along the perimeter would come forward demanding the same treatment. They sent a settlement offer designed to look generous while quietly requiring Caleb to withdraw his claim entirely, apologize publicly for delaying the project, and accept a modest payment in exchange for permanent silence. And Evelyn added almost as an afterthought that this was his last real chance to walk away with any dignity intact. Caleb refused without hesitation. At the first mediation session, Blaze slid photographs of the demolished garage across the table and dismissed the property as having negligible economic value, and Nora answered calmly that they were not suing over a collapsed tin roof. They were suing because the company had built its main entrance directly on top of land it never purchased. Blaze kept smiling, treating the claim as an obvious bluff, until Nora produced the original survey map, and several attorneys on the Hawthorne side exchanged uneasy glances as a junior associate quietly recognized that the parcel number on that old map never appeared anywhere in the company's modern acquisition records. Judge Graham Ellison, a calm and famously unbending presence on the bench, ordered a 10-day halt to a portion of construction so the disputed records could be verified, and even that short delay was enough to cost Hawthorne Dominion millions in lost momentum, idle contractors, and increasingly nervous investors watching the timeline slip. For the first time, Evelyn understood that Caleb had not come to court, chasing a payout. He had come to prove that her empire was standing on ground that had never belonged to her. During a recess that same afternoon, one of Hawthorne's own junior attorneys quietly pulled Blaze aside in the hallway to point out that the parcel number on the old survey matched an entry buried deep in the company's own title insurance file, a detail nobody had flagged before because the file itself ran hundreds of pages and had been assembled hastily during the original acquisition rush. Blaze brushed the concern aside in the moment, telling the younger attorney to focus on procedural objections rather than second-guessing documents the company had already relied upon for years, but the exchange lingered with him longer than he admitted to anyone. Evelyn, watching the exchange from across the hallway without hearing the specifics, noticed the shift in her own legal team's body language, the particular kind of quiet unease that settles over people who have just realized they might be defending a position built on sand. She said nothing to Blaze that day, but she asked her assistant that evening to pull the complete acquisition file for the surrounding parcels. The first time in the entire dispute she had bothered to look at the underlying paperwork herself, rather than relying entirely on second-hand summaries from her legal and communications teams. What followed was a methodical excavation of paper rather than earth, as Nora brought in an independent surveyor to map the exact boundaries of the Rourke utility corridor and compare them against Hawthorne Dominion's construction plans, and the results were worse for the company than even Caleb had expected. The corridor ran directly beneath the campus's main entrance, beneath the drainage system feeding the data center, and beneath the electrical and fiber lines connecting nearly every structure on the property, meaning that the larger the company built, the deeper it had unknowingly trespassed. Hawthorne's legal team had simply assumed, based on incomplete modern filings, that the entire parcel belonged to them outright and when Evelyn pressed Blaze to find a way to invalidate the old claim, he argued that the Rourke family had effectively abandoned the corridor by never actively developing it. Nora dismantled that argument by producing decades of tax receipts showing continuous, if modest, payment on the narrow strip, proof that the family had never relinquished its claim even as everyone else forgot the parcel existed. The most damaging discovery came from deep inside Hawthorne's own internal records, an email from a planning engineer years earlier flagging an unresolved ownership question beneath the utility corridor, a warning Blaze had dismissed at the time to avoid slowing the project down. That single buried message transformed the company's position from an honest mistake into something that looked, in front of a judge, uncomfortably close to a documented decision to ignore a known risk. Evelyn stopped sleeping well around this point, not merely because of the threat of financial damages, but because investors who learned the company had built on disputed land while sitting on an internal warning might reasonably start asking what else had been buried to keep the timeline intact. A quiet garage that had once seemed like the easiest problem in the entire project had somehow become the single loudest liability standing over the whole campus. Nora spent long nights cross-referencing county archives with the modern title chain, tracing every sale, every rezoning application, and every easement filed since the corridor was first surveyed, and what she found was less a single dramatic omission than a pattern of small negligences compounding across decades. Each time the surrounding parcels changed hands, the buyers had relied on the boundary description used in the previous transaction rather than commissioning a fresh survey, meaning an error made in one filing simply propagated forward through every subsequent deal without anyone noticing. Hawthorne Dominion had inherited that same flawed description when it acquired the surrounding lots, and rather than questioning why a narrow gap remained unaccounted for near the center of its own site plan, the acquisitions team had simply assumed it belonged to whichever adjacent parcel happened to be easiest to buy. Nora built a timeline exhibit for the court, laying the old maps beside modern satellite imagery, so the overlap between the Rourke corridor and the campus infrastructure became impossible to argue away as coincidence or misunderstanding. She also tracked down the retired engineer who had drafted the original planning memo warning about the unresolved ownership question, an older man living quietly outside the city who agreed, after some hesitation, to testify about how his warning had been dismissed in favor of keeping the project on schedule. His account added a human voice to what had otherwise been a paper trail, describing a meeting where executives waved away his concerns because pausing to verify boundary lines would have cost the company weeks it did not want to spend. Evelyn, reviewing the mounting evidence with Blaze late one night in her office, finally understood that the case no longer hinged on an obscure legal technicality, but on a documented decision to prioritize speed over diligence, the exact kind of decision regulators and investors alike tended to punish severely once it became public. Evelyn shifted tactics after that, inviting Caleb to the top floor of Hawthorne Dominion's headquarters, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the flattened lot where his garage had once stood, and this time she did not smile or mock him at all. She offered him an amount large enough to change his life several times over, a new house, tuition set aside for Lena's future, and funding to open another garage somewhere farther out, on the sole condition that he sign away all claim to the corridor, drop the lawsuit, and agree never to speak publicly about any of it. On paper, the offer was enormous, more money than Caleb had ever imagined seeing in his lifetime, arriving at a moment when he had already lost his business and had every practical reason to take it and disappear quietly. Evelyn believed, as she had believed from the very beginning, that everyone had a price, particularly a man raising a daughter alone with no financial safety net beneath him. Caleb looked out at the flattened lot below and asked her a single question, whether signing the agreement would mean she was admitting she had been wrong, and when she answered that this was simply business rather than a matter of right and wrong, he understood there was nothing left to discuss. He declined the offer, explaining that taking her money, while letting the company continue treating people the way it had treated him, would make him complicit in whatever came next for someone else standing in its path. Evelyn told him he was throwing away the only real chance he would ever get, and Caleb answered that he wasn't throwing anything away. He was simply refusing to sell the one thing his father had preserved, specifically, so people like her could never build on top of it. He left through the service elevator rather than the private one she offered him, and Evelyn stood at the window a long time afterward, watching him cross the lot below, slowly realizing that for the first time in her career money had failed to move an obstacle out of her way. Blaze pressed her afterward to consider a harder approach, suggesting the company quietly commission a rival survey designed to muddy the boundary question long enough to stall Caleb's case in procedural delays. But Evelyn, for reasons she did not fully explain even to herself, refused to authorize it. Something about the way Caleb had looked at the flattened lot below, without anger, without theater, had unsettled her more than any hostile letter or courtroom threat ever could, because it suggested a man who had already priced in the possibility of losing everything and found peace with it long before she ever offered him a way out. Conrad, informed of the failed negotiation, accused her of losing her nerve, insisting that a man in Caleb's position could still be worn down through attrition if the company simply extended the legal fight long enough to exhaust his resources and his patience. Evelyn did not entirely disagree with the strategy in principle, but she had begun to sense, watching the case unfold in front of reporters and shareholders, that dragging out a fight against a widowed father defending his family's land was a story the public would not forgive regardless of how it ended. She ordered Maris to soften the communications strategy, quietly retiring the narrative that painted Caleb as an obstacle to progress, though by then the shift arrived too late to undo the damage already done to the company's public image. In private, she began reviewing the original acquisition files herself for the first time, reading through years of memos with a scrutiny she had never previously applied, and finding, buried in the language of routine business decisions, an unmistakable pattern of choosing speed over caution again and again. The trial that followed drew a courtroom full of reporters, shareholders, and local residents who had spent months reading headlines calling Caleb an obstacle to progress, and Maris tried one final push to frame him as a man blocking thousands of jobs, but public sentiment had already begun shifting once it became widely known the garage had been demolished before the land dispute was ever resolved. Nora built her case methodically, presenting the 1949 survey, the continuous tax payments, the notarized ownership certificate, the internal warning email Hawthorne had buried, and photographs of bulldozers arriving before sunrise, framing Caleb not as an opponent of growth, but as a man defending property that had never legitimately changed hands. Blaze attempted to characterize the old documents as vague and outdated, but the independent surveyor confirmed under oath that the boundaries described in the 1949 map aligned precisely with the current utility corridor running beneath the campus, and Judge Ellison turned to Hawthorne's legal team and asked directly whether the company had known about this risk before ordering the demolition. In one of the trial's most damaging moments, a young associate on the Hawthorne legal team was forced to confirm under questioning that the internal warning email had, in fact, existed and had been ignored, and Evelyn watched her own attorney's credibility crumble in real time, understanding that her own team's decisions had helped bury her. The final and most consequential revelation came when Nora read aloud a clause buried in the original 1949 agreement, stating that if the corridor were ever used for large-scale commercial purposes without the owner's consent, the landowner retained the right to retroactive usage fees, damages, and an operational restriction until a valid agreement was reached. That single clause meant Hawthorne Dominion faced potential losses reaching tens of millions of dollars, along with the very real possibility of having to relocate infrastructure already built and functioning beneath the campus. Evelyn no longer looked at Caleb as a struggling mechanic who happened to be in the way. She now understood he was the one person holding the single most important key to whether her entire project could continue operating at all. Outside the courthouse each morning, the crowd grew larger, a mixture of reporters chasing the story, shareholders anxious for any hint of how the ruling might affect their holdings, and ordinary residents who who had started to see something of themselves in a man who refused to be pushed aside by a company that treated the whole city as raw material for its own ambitions. Nora called witness after witness with the patience of someone building a wall brick by brick, rather than trying to land a single dramatic blow. Bringing in county clerks to authenticate the original filings, tax office staff to confirm the decades of continuous payment, and the independent surveyor a second time to walk the judge through exactly how the modern infrastructure sat atop the old boundary lines inch by inch. Blaze, sensing the momentum shifting away from his client, attempted a late pivot, arguing that even if the ownership claim were valid, the appropriate remedy was a modest cash settlement rather than any injunction against a project already employing thousands of construction workers and promising thousands more permanent jobs once completed. Judge Ellison rejected the argument without much hesitation, noting from the bench that convenience to a defendant was never sufficient reason to excuse an ongoing trespass, particularly one entered into after an internal warning had already flagged the exact risk now playing out in his courtroom. Caleb testified only once, briefly, describing not the money at stake but the simple fact that his father and grandfather had paid for that strip of land fair and square and had never once been approached with a legitimate offer before the bulldozers arrived. His testimony ran only a few minutes, free of anger or theatrics, and several reporters later noted it as the most quietly devastating moment of the entire trial, precisely because it demanded nothing beyond an acknowledgement of simple, verifiable fact. Judge Ellison's ruling arrived without theatrics, a calm and precise document stating that Caleb held valid ownership over the Rourke utility corridor and that Hawthorne Dominion was barred from continued use of any structures built across that land until a lawful agreement was reached or a final judgment issued. The court further noted, in language that would be quoted in nearly every subsequent news article, that demolishing the garage before resolving the ownership dispute weighed heavily and unfavorably against the company's conduct throughout the entire matter. Hawthorne Dominion's stock dropped within hours as investors demanded explanations, corporate tenants threatened to walk away from signed leases over fears the campus might not open on schedule, and the data center itself could not legally operate if its own drainage and fiber lines sat on land the company had no right to use. Conrad turned his fury on Evelyn, the same man who had once dismissed Caleb as a stubborn relic, clinging to a dying trade, now forced to admit that a mechanic in oil-stained coveralls had brought an entire board of directors to its knees. Evelyn had no choice but to return to the negotiating table, except this time Caleb did not sit in a side hallway waiting to be summoned. He sat directly across from her, alongside Nora and an independent land use expert, and the terms reached that day left no room for the arrogance that had defined every earlier conversation between them. Hawthorne Dominion agreed to fully compensate Caleb for the destroyed garage, covering both its practical and sentimental value, to pay retroactive usage fees for the corridor, and to sign a long-term lease guaranteeing Caleb continued ownership while the campus operated above it. A portion of the settlement funded the construction of an entirely new garage on the legally protected parcel, and the company was required to issue a public statement acknowledging it had demolished the original building before the land dispute had been resolved. When every cost was totaled, the legal fees, the lost momentum, the retroactive fees, and the long-term lease payments, the price of underestimating one quiet man ran into the tens of millions of dollars, a sum far larger than anything the original settlement offer had ever proposed. The negotiations themselves took weeks rather than days, because Nora insisted every term be written with the same precision that had won the case in the first place, refusing to leave any language vague enough for Hawthorne Dominion's attorneys to reinterpret later once public attention moved on to some other story. Caleb asked for one additional condition beyond the financial terms, requiring the company to fund a modest scholarship for children of tradespeople in the surrounding neighborhood, a request that caught even Nora by surprise given how little he had asked for himself throughout the entire ordeal. Evelyn agreed to it almost immediately, partly as a gesture of genuine remorse, and partly because her communications team recognized it as one of the few remaining ways to soften a story that had otherwise been an unbroken chronicle of corporate arrogance meeting quiet, documented resistance. The final agreement was filed with the court rather than sealed privately, a detail Nora had insisted upon specifically so that any future landowner facing similar pressure from a large developer would have a clear precedent to point toward. Local news covered the signing ceremony with noticeably different language than it had used months earlier, describing Caleb not as an obstacle overcome, but as a private citizen who had successfully held a powerful company accountable through nothing more than patience, documentation, and an unwillingness to be intimidated. Even competitors of Hawthorne Dominion took notice, quietly ordering fresh boundary surveys on their own active projects, rather than risk becoming the subject of a similar story in a similar courtroom. In the months that followed, Caleb did not become a man who flaunted money or sought public revenge against the people who had once mocked him, choosing instead to rebuild quietly on the same protected ground his family had held for generations. The new garage, called Rourke Auto Works, rose in a more modern shape than the original. But the old cracked sign bearing his father's name was restored and mounted inside the front office as a reminder of exactly what had nearly been erased. Neighbors who had once repeated headlines calling him an obstacle to progress began bringing their cars back to him, and young mechanics started asking to apprentice under a man who had become, almost without meaning to, a symbol of an ordinary person standing firm against an enormous company and refusing to bend. Evelyn Hawthorne kept her position as chief executive, but she lost something harder to measure than money: the absolute confidence that had once let her dismiss anyone standing in her way without a second thought, and the board now required her to follow far stricter procedures for land acquisition, compensation, and community consultation before breaking ground on anything again. Conrad Kingswell did not survive the fallout at all, forced off the board entirely once shareholders discovered he had personally pressured the legal team to disregard the early internal warning about the corridor. On a quiet afternoon outside the new garage, Lena watched a line of cars waiting for service and asked her father whether they had really won, and Caleb looked toward the enormous campus in the distance. The same company now paying his family rent every single month to keep operating above land it had once tried to take by force, and told her that winning wasn't quite the right word, that what had really happened was that powerful people had finally been made to learn how to walk across someone else's land with a measure of respect. Nora went on to open her own small practice specializing in exactly the kind of overlooked property disputes that larger firms considered beneath their attention, and she credited the case, whenever asked, with teaching her that the most decisive evidence in any courtroom is rarely the most expensive to find, only the most patiently gathered. The retired engineer who had once been dismissed for raising an inconvenient warning was invited by a local university to speak to students about professional responsibility, and he used Caleb's story as the central example of what happens when caution gets overruled by deadlines. Even Maris, who had once built an entire campaign painting Caleb as a threat to progress, later admitted in an unguarded moment to a colleague that the hardest part of her job had never been managing public opinion, but living with campaigns she no longer believed in once the full truth came out. Evelyn kept a framed photograph on her desk for a while after the settlement, an image of the flattened lot the morning after the demolition, not as a trophy but as a reminder of exactly how quickly certainty could curdle into public disgrace when it was built on assumptions nobody had bothered to verify. Some evenings, driving home past the illuminated glass towers of the finished campus, she found herself glancing toward the modest garage still standing at its edge, its lights often burning late as Caleb finished one more repair before locking up for the night. She never contacted him again, outside of formalities required by the lease, but she made certain, from that point forward, that every acquisition her company pursued began with a survey conducted by someone with nothing at all to gain from getting the boundary wrong. Years later, when a business journalist writing a retrospective on the campus asked Evelyn what she had learned from the entire ordeal, she answered simply that speed had always felt like a competitive advantage until the day it collided with a family that had spent 3 generations moving at exactly the opposite pace, patiently, deliberately, and with paperwork that never once needed updating because it had been done correctly the first time. Caleb, for his part, never gave the interview the same journalist requested, preferring instead to let Lena grow up in a neighborhood where his name was once again attached to good work rather than headline controversy, the garage, humming along quietly the way it always had before anyone with a billion-dollar vision ever noticed it existed at all. On the morning they bulldozed Caleb Rourke's garage, they believed they were clearing an obstacle off a map. They never imagined that beneath that broken concrete sat a signature, decades of quiet sacrifice, and a strip of forgotten land with enough legal weight to force an entire empire to pay, indefinitely, simply for the right to remain standing.
Let's get it. But now she's in a predicament because whoever she dates next, they'll be like, oh, hell no, she was just with a fucking NBA big-ass basketball player right before me. Hell no. I'm cool. That's what they're going to say. Honestly, yes. Oh gosh. You're funny, Lindsay. I'm just joking around, but people will definitely think that. So I guess I'm not really joking around. Do I go back here?